Welcome to another conversation in People in Fundraising. This podcast features interviews with nonprofit professionals who discuss their career journeys, lessons learned, and enthusiasm for working in fundraising. And here is your host, the founder of People in Fundraising, Tim Wilson.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another conversation in the People in Fundraising nonprofit podcast series. I'm very excited today to talk with our guest, Evan Wildstein, who is joining us. Hello from Texas. How are you, Evan?
I'm good. We have to say howdy at least once in every conversation legally down here in Texas. So howdy.
Howdy. And I'm very excited for our conversation today. Before we started recording, Evan and I were just talking about the content that he will discuss, and he used the term interwoven and referenced a leadership development guru named Parker Palmer. And so I think as our audience listens and watches your conversation today, they'll get a real sense, Evan, of how you have interwoven various projects and initiatives into your nonprofit career. Is there anything you'd like to share with our audience before we get into the standard questions, please?
Well, thanks for having me. I will tell you, as a podcast host myself, you are far more organized with this than the show we have, although I do love our little corner over there. There's a lot of great minds out there whom I've read the entirety of the 22 years I've been in this sector. Parker Palmer, Bob Greenleaf, Kouzes and Postner, all the great leadership minds out there have been part of my learning curve as I've gotten into this work. Part of my 2 degrees that I've done on nonprofit management and organizational behavior. And I simply try in my daily work to understand what they were trying to teach us. And leadership training, I joke about this, but one of the things with leadership training is it really shows you what not to do. Not necessarily the most right thing to do, but some of the bad toxic behaviors to avoid. And Parker Palmer wrote a lot about the Undivided Life and other names I'm sure we'll get into. But there's so much goodness out there, and a lot of it comes from 50 years ago.
Awesome. That's great. I'm glad you have that background, academically and bringing that into professional nonprofit work as well. So yeah, Evan, you mentioned you're a podcast host. We'll talk about that as well. What we always do for every guest is if you can take a few minutes first, please, and tell us how you entered the nonprofit field and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. Like most, it'll be unsurprising. It was, world's greatest accident. I was in my, from my teens through my early 20s, I had performed in rock and roll bands. And I was doing that alongside getting my undergraduate degree. And it turned out that at the time, the band that I was with, it was a little punk rock band, were getting into the business of doing a lot of fundraising rock concerts where we would source the talent, we'd find the venue, we would find the charity or the nonprofit to work with. And I found myself at that time being kind of an unknown de facto development director. So I was working at an education degree at the time, and my advisor said, I could tell you're really interested in these passion projects that are music and nonprofit work. Would you ever consider wanting to shift over to that? And so I did, and I ended my undergrad degree with some cobbled together version of a nonprofit business degree with a focus on arts and culture.
Okay.
Got my first accidental job, number 1, number 2, number 3, blah, blah, blah. Fast forward 22 years. And I've spent roughly the last half of these 22 years formally in fundraising.
Okay.
Before that, I was in public programs, operations, and what a lot of people who may be in the arts and culture space realize that if you're a programs person in arts and culture, you often act as a producer, and producers in Hollywood raise money. And so I guess I've been fundraising directly or indirectly for the entirety of my nonprofit career.
That's great. That is a unique story of how people get into the field. Thank you. And where do you find yourself now in your career in terms of, we mentioned the podcast, you're an author as well. We'll get into that. Where can people find you online and your services, please?
Oh, sure. So I am a practitioner. Except for one little break sort of in the middle of my career, I've always worked in a nonprofit for the nonprofit space. There are fantastic consultants, coaches, and vendors out there who go do projects that drive their passion more. I always find that my cup is filled when I'm in an organization. So for the past year, and hopefully for the next 16 years, I've been the head of advancement for a great little Montessori program here in Houston, Texas.
Oh, great.
Montessori Montessori is a very non-traditional form of education where students are grouped together in 3-year arcs. And so you have like the intro student, the middle, and then the older one who can develop leadership skills by helping the younger ones be part of it.
Awesome.
Um, and advancement in our school is everything from fundraising and school events to marketing communications and a whole larger portfolio of work. So it's fundraising plus
Yes.
in my world here. But, you know, I do ponder and pontificate on LinkedIn a lot about things that could be better in
Mm,
this social sector, specifically here in the US, because that's what I know. And
yeah.
there are NGOs and charitable organizations throughout the world. The American ones are the United States ones, I should say, because we do have plenty of friends in other parts of America.
Sure.
We're having a rougher go than many are
Yeah.
compared to the rest of the world. And by the time this episode comes out, who knows how it's going to look out there? But I
Sure.
imagine it's going to continue to be really interesting in early 2025 and beyond.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think I know the reason why you put this next 16-year timestamp on your association with the Montessori school, but for our audience, whatever you're comfortable sharing, why 16 more years?
Well, my wife and I have the world's best toddler who's about 2,
Awesome.
and you know, consistency is really important. And so it'd be nice if dad didn't, you know, shift jobs every 3 to 5 years.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, and just that sort of consistency would allow for a lot of focus, which we don't often get in this sector.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so true. Thank you for that. I spent the first 18 years of my career in prospect research at Harvard Business School, and most of those years I had a very young family at the time, and so I totally get the consistency is important. I wasn't traveling for work, um, and by that point, my oldest is now 18, but by the time she was starting elementary school, I had pretty significant PTO and sick time, and I could go to doctor's appointments and what have you. So totally with you on the consistency with family life. So thank you for sharing that.
And that my wife and I have what I would say is like a sort of gender atypical roles that we hold in our
Mm.
careers. And this is not meant to sound any particular way, but my wife is the hardest working person I know in corporate America.
Awesome.
And that allows me to have these nonprofit jobs that come with that great flexibility.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. And thank you for talking about how you entered the nonprofit space. You touched on a couple of uh, words, phrases, leadership, certainly, as you described getting into nonprofit work and what you do now. Um, and as I did some research on LinkedIn to get my questionnaire all ready for your conversation, I was very struck that somewhere in LinkedIn on a post, you have developed the title of, quote, the Chief Decent Human Behavior Officer, end quote. And I would love for you to share with our audience what that means, what you envision that title signifying to people, how you came up with that particular phrase, and get into its final wording as it is now.
Yeah. It's a fun story and it's one you can't see because my screen is blurred. And also this will some people will only listen to this, but I've got a poster up over here that says Chief Decent Human Behavior Officer, CDHPO. About 8, 10 years ago, the organization I was at, it was a university, a fairly large university here in Houston, and the HR talent team created this sort of cohort of people from the different divisions in the university. So I was working at the time as the head of fundraising for an urban research institute, and I got tagged as the rep from this particular corner of the university to come join this like 2 or 3 month leadership cohort.
Okay.
And it was interesting because as a fundraising person, the director of the division where I worked was a little curious why our ops HR person wasn't the one invited to
Oh,
join this little cohort. And it was me. And the reason I was invited is because I'd gone to the talent management people, our HR VP, to talk about ways that I could help develop the team. that was working under me. I was, maybe halfway into my career and really interested in team growth, but also not very skilled at it because I've always managed people, but I think
Mhm.
management and leadership, very different things that have very
Yes.
practical implications. And she said she found in me someone who was just uniquely curious about the way that people can grow and develop in an organization, or if they're too big for the organization, to help find their next journey.
Yeah.
So I got invited to this cohort that for several months we worked around some of the names that I mentioned earlier, Jim Kouzis and Barry Postner, Parker Palmer, Bob Greenleaf, who's
Mm.
the guy who gave us the phrase servant leadership, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And then at some point throughout this cohort, in one of the one-on-one sessions I had with the person, she said, "You're kind of like a decent human behavior officer,
Uh-huh.
maybe your organization's chief decent human behavior officer," because what I've grown to think about that phrase, and I wrote a little something for it for the Nonprofit Hive. If
Oh
people
yeah.
don't know about the Nonprofit Hive, that's Tasha Van Black's baby, and they have a blog, and I wrote this whole article on why organizations should have CDHBOs.
Mm.
And, I'd love for that to be a paid position, but I also think philosophically, every organization should have someone there who thinks about the spaces between the work.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
Spaces between the work are parents whose kids are sick and they just need flex time. They need to be able to work from home. Stuff
Yeah.
that maybe is work oriented or work adjacent, but not uniquely tied to their work. And I've always just naturally gravitated towards those kinds of processes.
Yeah.
Um, and it's hard because it takes mental energy. I would say like the cost is emotional currency, not necessarily dollar currency,
Hmm.
because you have to be open to that, and not every employee is open to growth, and et cetera, et cetera. So
Yes.
it's just been kind of fun, and I've ran with it, and I have a poster, and it's cool to talk about.
Yes, thank you. I was just writing down your phrase there, spaces between the work, and that is definitely much more of a conversation in today's work environment than when you and I first started almost 25 years ago. There was some talk of work-life balance, but it was like, no, you're in the office 5 days a week, and you know, very little consideration that I was aware of for flexible work arrangements.
Yeah, especially I think in your line of work, where I don't mean to be reductive when I think about prospect research, but like so much of that work can be done wherever the researcher is comfortable doing.
Yes.
I remember when I was at a university and our designated prospect researcher, we only communicated electronically. She was awesome. But
Hmm.
even this was pre-COVID and everything. We never met. There was no, I said, I met so and so interestingly at a coffee house. Can you help do some research on them? So
Right.
um, and what a lot of organizations are finding these days is that, and we could talk a little bit about the survey that I do too, like the
Yes.
reasons why people are, um, there are reasons why people leave, reasons why
Hmm.
people think about leaving, and there are also glaring reasons why people stay. And what we have found, a colleague and I have found in this research that we've done for the past 2 years, is that flexibility with their job, be that hybrid schedule, remote schedule, or something else, is top, 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 top reason why
Absolutely.
people are, beyond compensation, beyond passion for the work, beyond everything else, double digit points higher. That
Wow.
flexibility with the work, it's just sort of like you will lose candidates if you can't be open to that kind of work. Um,
Absolutely.
some scopes of work are different, like you can't really have a remote surgeon yet,
Right.
but
Yeah.
most other nonprofits can find a way to flex with their people, for their people.
Absolutely. Yes. And that's a wonderful segue, Evan. You just talked about this staff survey. And before we were recording, you gave me the full name of the survey. And so I'd love for you to take a few minutes now and roll that out to our audience, what you want to share about that, please.
Absolutely. It's a very fun, I would call it a side project, but all these things are just the things that pay me in emotional support, not necessarily dollars.
Great. Yeah.
Um, there's a name, again, I'll drop a lot of names on the show, but if folks don't know about Michelle Flores Bryn, who's
Mhm.
a friend and a colleague of mine, we just both happen to be in Texas. That doesn't have any bearing on anything. But a couple of years ago, it was 2023. The year before, we got invited by AFP Houston to speak on staff self-care.
Okay.
They put us in the big room. There were hundreds of people shouting questions at us. It was great. And at the time, Michelle and I were both in-house practitioners, and we said there's a lot of research out there on employee well-being, on staff well-being. But in our sector, what we found, and no shade at our consulting friends, but what we tended to find was a lot of the research out there was being done by consultancies or coaching organizations with the fundamental business development case of hire us to help you fix it.
Yes.
And there comes some gravity with that, which is not entirely charitable, if
Mm.
I'm being honest. And so Michelle and I said, we're practitioners. What if we freely and openly collect this data anonymously, get it out there for the world to see? And so we're about to release, I think this episode may go up in the summer, but it's April now that we're talking, and we'll release the data from the second year of this survey, the Social Impact Staff Retention Project, SISR or SISR,
Mm.
that asks very obvious but pointed questions about, are you looking for new work? Why? If you're not looking for new work, why? Tell us about how many years you've worked in the sector. Tell us what corner of the sector you're in. Are you in healthcare? Are you in education? Tell us about the kind of work you do. Are you in marketing? Are you in programs? Are you in fundraising?
Yeah.
And it's very simple. Truly, it's a 2 to 3 minute survey because people are so distracted these days. You can't really give them a 20-minute questionnaire
Right.
anymore. And both years, we've had a few hundred people participate, and we've found very consistent things that we hear. I'm
Mm.
sure you've heard from guests on your show and elsewhere in the sector.
Yeah.
And last year and this year, we've also leaned into trying to provide some practical advice for ways to improve on things that nonprofiteers are telling us are
Yeah.
bothering them. And this year, we've interviewed a bunch of nonprofit CEOs, board leaders, funders, and other decision makers to try and get their take on
Okay.
this. Because
Awesome.
data in the hands of a middle manager is fairly useless if they are not in positions of authority or
Totally.
influence. So
Totally.
if anyone listening is a key decision maker for their organization and want to know what the field is telling us, specifically here in the US, go check out the survey and start talking about that with your team. Hire a consultant if you need to, but I'm sure you have chief decent human behavior officers inside who are not yet identified that you can uplift to help solve some of these issues.
Absolutely. So that is a wonderful project, so timely and helpful for our industry. I assume the survey is already closed, or because you're close to airtime going live
Correct.
with it.
We tend to open the survey collection response period like September, October. And
Okay.
so September 2025, folks should be on the lookout to come participate. We use a very clean
Okay.
survey tool. You can keep it anonymous if you like, or you could share your email and we always share the results, but it is truly that data are kept separate. And so
Okay.
it's, and people have been very honest with us.
Good. That's good. Where can people who are interested, who may want to participate in a future survey, but are interested in the current results, where might they find those results and when? And anything you can share about that, please, Evan.
Yeah, LinkedIn is kind of the place that I spend most of my
Okay.
uh, I won't call it derogatory time, but I am often venting about things. So if you just search Social Impact Staff Retention Project on LinkedIn, and if you're a World Wide Web person, if you go to thenonprofiteers.com/SISR, that's the sort of de facto landing page where you can find last year's survey, this year's survey. You could sign up for updates. We do not spam email. We email once a year to say, take the survey. We email once a year to say, here are the results. That's it.
Awesome. Awesome. Excellent. Um, Speaking of websites and other projects that you interweave into your life, you have co-launched and co-host a nonprofit podcast. And as I share my screen to bring up the website where people can find it, Evan, if you'd like to talk a little bit about this podcast, how it came to be, and um, who you co-host it with, and anything else that might be of interest to our audience.
Absolutely. This is yet another side passion project that pays me in good vibes and currently nothing else. But another name that I mentioned earlier that folks really should know is Tasha Van Black, who was one of the creators for the Nonprofit Hive. Tasha is a dear friend now and colleague who makes her home up in Canada. And we found ourselves for months. We got connected initially through the We Are for Good community. They have a great
Yes.
podcast, and they're far more than a podcast only. They're sort of a networking community for nonprofiteers. But Tasha and I found ourselves to be kindred spirits in the way that we just painfully love this industry, but we also realize that a lot of the issues that happen in the sector are caused by the sector. It's
Mm,
not all funders, it's not all the community out there. A lot of this stuff we do to ourselves. And
sure.
so we would message, we would text, we'd have phone calls every now and then, and we'd always found ourselves talking about the nonsense that's out there, but there's also a
Yeah,
ton of good nonsense out there. And
sure.
one of the things we came to saying is like we just kept repeatedly saying to one another, we should record these conversations because they're
Uh-huh.
chock full. It's just a phone call that's really chock full of edgy, no bullshit advice. And then
Yeah,
we just decided, let's do that. Let's call it good nonsense and let's invite often new names to have
cool.
conversations. Like in our first season, which we just closed today, we had someone named Erica Keswin join us, who is a world famous three-time Wall Street Journal best-selling author on good behaviors at work. Not a nonprofit person,
Okay,
but any nonprofiteer should read her books. The first one is
great.
Bring Your Human to Work, Rituals Roadmap, and the Retention Revolution. If you're
Wow.
interested in the way that people can grow and grow better in an organization, her books are great. And I just sort of responded to one of her e-newsletters one day and I said, you want to come on a nonprofit podcast? Fully expecting there to be a ghosting. And she said, sure,
Sure.
tell me when. So we
Wow.
had like big flashy names like Erica Keswin. Michelle Flores Brin was a guest for us.
Awesome.
The episode that just came out today, a wonderful, wonderful person named Samira Musavi who does grief counseling work for children and adolescents who've lost a loved one in
Mm,
California. So the cool thing about this show is they're brief, 25, 30-minute conversations.
yeah.
Uh, the show is currently unsponsored, but I always make fun of sponsors by, saying ridiculous things like this episode is sponsored by the number 23 or nouns. It's just a good bit of fun. And there's no script for the shows. We kind of just do what we're doing here. You invite someone to talk a little bit about themselves and it goes where it goes.
Yes, absolutely. That's awesome. I will have to check it out, and I'll put that link to the website as well as other links when your interview goes live. Evan, we have about 5 minutes left. Um, I would like, if possible, for you to take some of this time or take this time. Um, you've mentioned the term servant leadership, and I'm very curious, what are the most essential benefits that, in your opinion, servant leadership can bring to nonprofit work, to the teams they manage, the teams they interact with, um, instilling a more positive spaces between the work culture, and things of that nature. Kind of tying in a lot of what you have so generously talked about so far.
Yeah, it's something that drives, in front of the curtain and behind the curtain for me. It's a philosophy and a series of behaviors that drive much of what I do now. And I think when a lot of people hear the phrase servant leadership, they immediately go to historic figures, MLK Jr., Jesus Christ, other religious leaders, and people who led faithy movements. Servant
Mhm.
leadership as a philosophy does go back as far as history goes. But the
Yeah.
guy who coined the phrase, his name is Robert Greenleaf. I
Mm,
like to call him Bob, even though he and I never met, but he is like the one person no longer with us that I would love to have a cup of tea with. Everybody's got their
sure.
person. So Bob Greenleaf in the probably from 1920 to the 1960s was an in-house kind of de facto management consultant at AT&T. Very
Okay.
different company, a century ago than it was now, but they kept trying to promote him up to senior management roles and he kept saying, I really enjoy what I'm doing. This is where I get my
Mm,
kicks.
yeah.
And at some point in the 50s or the 60s, he read Journey to the East by Hermann Hesse and found in this book, if listeners aren't familiar, it's a metaphorical book. There's this sort of metaphorical group, and they're on a metaphorical journey to the metaphorical East.
Mm,
And you find along the way that there is a servant in the group named Leo, who is makes their meals, he washes their clothes. And you find at the end of the book, I'll fast forward, Leo disappears, the group falls apart. And
oh,
Greenleaf took from this the leadership of this group really came from the servant, the
yeah.
person that no one really thought about. And it transformed his life. He wrote this essay called The Servant as Leader in 1970.
Okay.
And it's, again, I'd said this to you, I think, before we started recording, but it's kind of like this Ted Lasso type of reading where it's chemically mind altering but you don't walk away with a lot of practical things of what to do with it. Greenleaf wrote about a lot of these behaviors that he believed servant leaders come with. It's listening, it's empathy, it's healing, commitment to the growth of people, building community, all these other things. And there's a guy who is now a friend of mine. I'm really proud to say his name is Larry Spears. Larry Spears took all of Greenleaf's writing and codified down the 10 or so most written about traits of what Greenleaf believed servant leaders were. And they're really practical things. I mean, especially people in fundraising, you want to be an active listener.
Yeah.
You want to be empathetic with the people you're meeting with, even if you don't have the experience they have. Rob Volpe, I think, is a guy who wrote about cognitive or affective empathy, one of which is the empathy you have to talk with someone who's lost someone because you've lost someone. And the other kind of empathy is, I will go with you to the funeral home because I don't have this experience, but I want to be there with you. There I am also, is what some servant leader writers have said. And Greenleaf stuff just really profoundly changed me when I discovered it maybe about 12 years ago. And I decided to do my master's degree at Gonzaga University with a servant leadership focus. I wrote my thesis on servant leadership and philanthropy and how those 10 traits of servant leadership can make a better fundraising experience.
Wow.
And Larry Spears, who, again, that now friend of mine, was one of my professors, said, you should turn this into a book. And so I pitched it to a few publishers. The book came out 2 years ago this month, and I haven't really spoken about the book so much since. I'm really proud to, but it's one of those things where I think servant leadership gets a bad rap because of the words. I mean, who wants to be a servant? Everyone wants to be a leader, but who wants to be a servant? And I think the mentality that to serve, I have to put myself at the back burner is also a misnomer. I think servant leadership grows all by making every boat lifted by the tide, and that includes our own boat, and that comes with self-awareness, that comes with healing ourselves. So people should, I would encourage everyone to don't buy my book, but go buy a copy of Bob Greenleaf's essay, The Servant as Leader, because it will change your life.
Awesome. I will add that to my Amazon queue. But if you can please, Evan, tell people, the title of the book you published 2 years ago. I'd love for people to get that information as well, please.
Yeah, what a terrible self-salesperson, right? It's the Nonprofiteer's Fundraising Field Guide, and it's 70 some odd pages long. You can read it, as someone told me, on one trip to the bathroom, which is kind of gross, but it's also lets you know how brief it is, and it's really bite-sized chapters. There's maybe like 5 full sections. You can get through it on a train ride or a plane ride or the bathroom if that's what you choose to do.
Awesome. Well, Evan, this has been just a very rich, enlightening conversation. I really appreciate how you have drawn from several thought leaders, and you mentioned them by name, Bob Greenleaf, Parker Palmer, your professor who's now a good friend of yours, and how you've taken some of their insights and applied it into your life, and then you share that with the people in your network on LinkedIn and your podcast and so forth. I've just thoroughly enjoyed our time together this morning.
Likewise. Thank you for making the space. It's a very cool show. I'm glad to be part of it.
Thank you so much, Evan. I look forward to following your content on LinkedIn. I encourage other people in the people and fundraising audience, please follow Evan Wildstein. Lots of great content that you put out in various vehicles. So including SISR, the Social Impact Staff Retention Project, which will be coming out, I think you said in May.
Probably next week, we're going to release the full report. So
great.
By the time people listen, you'll be able to go and see 2 years of functional data.
Awesome. Congratulations on launching that. I hope that it gets the attention that it definitely deserves in our field.
I hope so. Thank you again.
Thank you. And for our audience, you can find Evan's terrific conversation on various platforms in June 2025. LinkedIn with the link to the YouTube audio video portion. Also, the audio only will be available as it goes live on LinkedIn, on Spotify and Podbean. And thanks to my 100th People in Fundraising guest, Luis Diaz, and his donor participation project, who sponsors my website, you can find Evan's conversation there at peopleinfundraising.wordifysites.com. So again, thank you, Evan, for your time. I wish you all the best and look forward to staying in touch.
Me too. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.